I'm a professor from University of Iceland.
Okay. So, Stephen, you have introduced yourself.
I'll introduce
Okay.
myself. I'll
Yeah.
introduce myself.
You want to do that, or I can do it? I don't want to take your time. You have the full 1 hour, to do whatever you would like to do. Yeah.
Okay, well, no, I'm
I can
happy
do
to do.
that. Definitely. I can
I'll
do
do
it for you. No
you want
problem.
to, however you want to do it. That's fine.
Okay. Okay. Sure.
I hope the quarantine police don't call me during my presentation. They might. They called this time yesterday.
Really? I thought they would just text you.
No, they called me.
Wow. I just want to make sure you're okay.
Yeah.
But we have a really good turnout today. We have 23.
Excellent.
Okay, 1 minute.
All right, we are going to start in 1 minute. All right, so I hope everybody is ready. But thank you so much, for being with us. So I'm going to get started in 1 minute. Make sure everybody get online so that we can listen to Professor Stephen Hartman's talk. This is one of our pre-conference online seminar. So Professor Hartman is going to have 40 minutes to present his work. And then after that, we are going to open the floor for Q&A. So please bring your questions, your feedback, your comments to us. Okay, so everyone, good morning in Taiwan, and good day, good evening, good afternoon around the world. So thank you so much for joining us for this second day, September the 1st in Taiwan, pre-conference online seminar given by Professor Stephen Hartman, titled Developing the Role of Humanities in International Sustainability Science. That's a fascinating topic. He is going to tie together humanities, the disciplines of humanities and social sciences with the so-called hard science. How is all this knowledge going to be integrated in order to sort of effect on our sustainability goal. So Professor Hartman is a visiting professor in the Faculty of History and Philosophy. Philosophy, University of Iceland, and he also serves as a Principal Sustainability Executive Director for Whitecore Ltd, Sweden. I think he has many positions. I'm not going to, I don't think I'm going to exhaust the list here. I just would like to say that he has been doing a lot of work, not only with EU, but also with UNESCO, with different major institutions, universities around the world, and he is also the director of Circumpolar Observatory of Humanity for the Environment of Global Network of Observatories. So should I give the floor to Professor Hartman? So the floor is yours, Stephen.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here, and I want to thank you, Professor Wang, for inviting me. It's a great privilege to be here, and I'm so excited for these 2 weeks that we're going to have together. So thanks again, and thank you to your whole team who've been really amazing. I'm going to sort of jump right in with both feet and share my screen first here. I think I almost have it here. Just bear with me for a second. And here we go. Do you see my PowerPoint slide?
Yes.
I'm now going to try to go into full screen mode.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah,
Yeah.
please. Okay, good, good.
Yeah. So thanks again. And yeah, the title of my talk is Developing the Role of the Humanities in International Sustainability Science, and with the subtitle of Addressing 21st Century Global Challenges. And you'll note that I put in brackets environmental humanities, and for good reason. And I'll talk a little bit about during the course of the talk. I think that as this preparations for this piece developed, it made more and more sense, I think, to address the environmental humanities. But broadly speaking, I want to say that what I'm saying for the environmental humanities applies very, very well to very much of the humanities domain, and the sustainability humanities, and social sciences as well. And so this is why I chose to insert environmental in there. The talk that I'm giving today is based upon a chapter that I wrote for a volume that's coming out later this year, and that I co-wrote with Serpil Opperman, eco-critic from Cappadocia University, and Marco Armiero, the director of the Environmental Humanities Laboratory at KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. There seems to be maybe some strange noise. I don't know if everybody's got somebody needs to put their mute on. Maybe. I'm not quite sure if that can be fixed.
Okay, Kimi, would you please mute everybody so that we can have a smooth presentation from Professor Hartman? Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay. So what I want to say in starting this is that I'm really channeling the work of Serpil Opperman, Marco Armero, and myself in this presentation. And we worked together very closely on this chapter that is the basis for this talk. And we, in working together, we just didn't write our own sections, but we worked very much with each other's writings as well, revising one another, so that before the work was done, we had our hands in all the different parts of the chapter, and this is truly sort of co-executed and co-authored in that sense, and in the best possible sense. And so I'm here presenting it today, but really this is the work of these three people. So the environmental humanities represent one of the few areas in the academic domain of the humanities that has seen steady, even striking growth in recent years in the higher education sector. Early in the present decade of action to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals, this field is more relevant than ever. It bucks trends that have seen an alarming increase in defunding and shuttering of traditional humanities programs since the global crisis of 2008. Viewed in the broadest possible way, the environmental humanities may appear as something of a cornucopia of disciplines, theories, and approaches concerned with all matters environmental, which is to say with all processes, constructs, conceptions, and phenomena tied up in the Gordian knot of social and natural interrelations. Environmentally engaged research in the humanities has a long history extending back, in some cases, many decades into the previous century, most notably in fields such as environmental anthropology and archaeology, environmental history, environmental ethics, and environmental geography. It's emerged more recently in some resurgent modes of political ecology, as well as in the prolific field of eco-criticism or literature and environment, as Lawrence Buell, Ursula Heise, and Karen Thornburg sought to rebrand eco-criticism generically more than a decade ago. The rebranding didn't really take, possibly because eco-criticism was already in the process of morphing into something else that we now have all come to call the environmental humanities. That's my argument in any case. At the same time, these authors, Buell, Heise, and Thornburg, described, or at that time, back in 2011, they described the eco-critical field rather as an eclectic, pluriform, and cross-disciplinary initiative that aims to explore the environmental dimensions of literature and other creative media in the spirit of environmental concern, not limited to any one method or commitment. Now, in the decades since Buell et al. Hedged somewhat on the label of eco-criticism, a more radical interdisciplinary environmental humanities field has indeed come into force. This development has been less the result of any programmatic unifying efforts among environmentally oriented humanities disciplines, though some have definitely been undertaken. It's less that than it would appear to be the effect of a general drift in the academy, evident for decades now, but intensifying dramatically in the past several years. This drift represents a move toward question and issue-driven approaches tied to widely perceived crises of social, ecological precarity in the present century. In the 2020s, the environmental humanities extends far beyond representation in the inquiry concerning environmental questions in literature and other creative media, as Buell et al. Conceived of eco-criticism a decade ago. It also extends well beyond scrutiny of various sources of historical data and other archives as an anchoring methodology of environmental history. The present decade continues to see the launch of international journals and academic publishing series. I'm going to just flash by some slides that give a sense of the fecundity, I guess you could say, of the field of environmental humanities. So this decade is really, it continues to see the launch of international journals and academic publishing series in the field, whose editorial boards bring together specialists and academic, or rather specialists from a much wider range of disciplines than would have been found even a decade ago. Many from not even from fields that are, or disciplines that are not even really endemic to the humanities as conceived in a mainstream sense, not so very long ago, let's say in the 1990s or before the millennium shift. What I'm putting up here gives some sense of the different publishing series, the different study associations, the different programs in environmental humanities, and the different conferences that are given. It seems almost, bi-weekly, if not more often. Somewhere in the world, there's an environmental humanities conference going on, and actually, just to jump back again here, what I should mention about these is that these slides here that I'm showing right now are actually from 5 years ago, when I gave a talk at the World Humanities Conference on the state of the environmental humanities then. Since then, the environmental humanities has really taken off a lot more. So this represents kind of the diversity of programs and publishing series and conferences and associations 5 years ago, and it's exploded since then. And back then, when I was showing these slides 5 years ago, when I first prepared them, it felt like it had exploded then, but it's really exploded since then. So what we've witnessed in that short time is a rapid progression of disciplinary currents of many of the humanistic disciplines noted above that I just mentioned a minute ago, as these are converging increasingly into a common stream, now more generally evident as a pluralistic scholarly community of practice that increasingly we're calling the environmental humanities. This disciplinary confluence, I believe, will eventually inundate and likely replace most of the tributaries that have formed it. Increasingly, there's lots of signs of that, I believe. Increasingly interdisciplinary and post-disciplinary environmental humanities projects and programs are launching at such an advancing pace that it's no longer a simple task to keep abreast of all the latest study courses. These are the ones that were just part of a single network that took place. These are 5 of about 20 workshops and some international symposia that took place in the Nordic Network for Interdisciplinary Studies. between, say, 2010 and 2017. And these are only 5 of those 20 or so. This pace that they're launching at now, it makes it really difficult to keep abreast of all the latest courses of study, subject clusters, major and minor study tracks, or higher degree offerings, say master's and PhD offerings, at universities around the world that align themselves with this relatively new field. Many of these see eco-critics or environmental historians teaming up with anthropologists, environmental philosophers, um, human and physical geographers, environmental sociologists, historical ecologists, art historians, and sustainability education theorists and practitioners, to name only a few examples of integrated research and scholarship that are defining the field of environmental humanities today, as opposed to the distinct traditions, say, eco-criticism or environmental history or environmental anthropology, environmental philosophy. These are no longer really in their own silos in the humanistic sort of field of the environmental humanities. And I think that this is having a very, very generative sort of almost a kind of poesis that's taking place, academic poesis, whereby even if you're not in the field of the environmental humanities, there's a great deal of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary knock-on effects that can affect other fields and are in other areas, say medical humanities and digital humanities as well. Many of, or rather, the previously suggested cornucopia, I feel is now entering a new phase of engagement during, let's say, the past 5 to 10 years with a renewed focus and sense of purpose. Nowadays, it might be more appropriate to describe the environmental humanities complex that's emerged in a phrase suggested by geographer Noel Castry as, quote, a house with many rooms, unquote, that is far from complete, as an organically and somewhat spontaneously co-designed common structure. This half-built house, as Castry puts it metaphorically, promotes what he sees as a powerful feeling of, if not family, then certainly community and solidarity. So this structure is evolving not only in response to newly shared and learned methodologies, theories, and educational practices across disciplines, but also as emerging inquiries whose informing influences are as apt as not to be extra academic. There's greater crossover going on between the academy and society in a variety of ways. Deriving, I think, from a growing cultural, social, and political cognizance of the precarity of social ecological systems, they are appreciable in news cycles and everyday discourses that flow out from them. From reportage on high-level policy, discussions to kitchen table conversations over the latest 1 in a 100-year storm or heat wave occurring in clusters, sometimes year after year during the past decade alone. We're now in the midst of what's certainly going to be in the top 10 warmest years, and that will make it 8 of the last years, the 8 hottest years on record, almost certainly. The high visibility of these issues in our societies signals a dawning, if not an escalating awareness, that the very systems that are structuring and sustaining multi-species communities all over the earth are at risk of undergoing regime shifts for which the world isn't remotely prepared. The full potential of the environmental humanities as an evolving field lies at the intersections of endogenous influences and exogenous developments, erasing lines of demarcation between higher education and the research sector on the one hand, and fraught systems of life and death on the other that we encounter in our lives outside of the academy routinely, either directly up close or in mediated forms in our sort of media ecologies. In one sense, the good life for a relative minority occurs at an unimaginable distance from the degradation of social ecological systems around the world, as the most vulnerable people and the least protected ecosystems become the invisible costs of doing business. At the same time, extractive exploitation tied up in dominant systems of production and consumption are coming to be perceived and understood as manifestly unsustainable. They have been perceived and understood that way by a lot of people for a very long time, but now to a larger and larger segment of the population throughout societies around the world. It's not just those people who are ahead of the curve, but society in general is beginning to sense that we're in a very, very difficult moment, a crisis, an emergency. Serious consequences await, all the more serious for our students and for their students and their children. And these crises have brought a new sense of urgency to higher education and the research sector. And in that sense, I think the environmental humanities is very, very responsive to the time that we're living in and concerns about the future or futures that may await us. So the environmental humanities, while they're defined by an underlying concern with social ecological questions and with a preoccupation with environmental change, they also contain multitudes, as Walt Whitman wrote of himself. You know, the great diversity this great diversity extends to theories, methods, subjects, materials, and often enough positions on many of the most momentous questions we're facing. And I think it's a sign of the field's fecundity that many scholars in the field disagree with one another, sometimes vehemently on a number of core issues. That very situation reflects the wealth and the health of the field, being a sign that the environmental humanities as a field is still very much in the though it's very much in the making, it also really hasn't lapsed into doctrine or dogma, and it hasn't yet come to its flowering, I don't think. This also suggests a preference for an academic practice based on respectful listening and understanding rather than on winning every argument. So I want to transition a little bit here and talk about how the environmental humanities, in a couple of different ways, is responding to the needs of sustainability science. And we're going to end up with sustainability science in this talk, so I'll get there. But I want to take a couple of stops along the way, beginning first with environmental justice, and then with material eco-criticism and its influences on environmental humanities, and then ending up with integrated environmental humanities at the intersection of sustainability science. You know, following the reflections that I've just made, it might sound reasonable to anticipate skeptics, let's say, and ask, you know, what are the environmental humanities good for? The counter objections, however, are apt to come immediately in our questioning of the legitimacy of that kind of question. As critical humanities scholars, aren't we obligated to challenge the productivist rhetoric that seems to be haunting academia in its current neoliberal iteration, where universities are expected to produce knowledge that is immediately quantifiable and useful and usable, but usable to whom? And to what end? We always need to be asking, and we are asking those questions. This kind of instrumentalist argument has often been employed by politicians of a certain market-oriented stripe to shutter academic humanities programs, which they deem either to be too progressive or too opaque for sensibilities that only appreciate the sharp angles or the concrete stolidity of factories and power plants or the targeted fluidity of brokerage firms. Accusing the environmental humanities of being too oblong, too qualitatively indefinite, is a political and inherently an ideological challenge to forms and modes of knowledge that do not lend themselves overtly to a market economy. And here, when I'm talking about the environmental humanities, I really am talking about the humanities more generally, because this is not just true of the environmental humanities, it's true of the many fields and subject areas within the humanities. Quote, why should taxpayers foot the education bill for an anthropologist who can't find a job? End quote. This is what the U.S. Republican governor of Florida, Rick Scott, asked, exemplifying the paradigmatic neoliberal attack on social sciences and humanities disciplines for the fault of being too far removed from the immediate calculus of market forces to have any real value to society. Arguably, the American incubated culture wars and their self-interested criticisms reflect a corporate vision of the academy that effectively trains student consumers to become uncritical consumers or docile, precarious workers. At least that seems to be the logic of that approach. My co-authors and I, on the contrary, believe that it's precisely their social and political relevance for the challenges of the contemporary world, to some degree independent of market forces, that has made social sciences and the humanities the preferred target of some radical political agendas and attack campaigns. Imagining possible futures, questioning colonial pasts and present, tearing apart the veil that silences and normalizes injustice, speaking truth to multiple forms of power, rethinking the practices of citizenship, and not least, working to identify, reconceive, and safeguard the institutions of the commons are only some of the useful things that the human sciences in general and the environmental humanities in particular know how to do very well. Therefore, asking, what is the environmental humanities good for, this does not need to imply a neoliberal vision of the role that higher education should play within our societies. The direct social and political engagement of the environmental humanities with current socio-ecological crises is a major part of the field's value. The engagement is neither linear nor monothematic, but rather it entails a multiplicity of angles. This engagement is, or rather, what invariably all of these angles or approaches have in common is that they are very different from the search for techno fixes, typically pushed by neoliberal interests as the answers to our society's most intractable problems. For example, work on toxicity and environmental justice carried out by environmental humanities scholars doesn't stop at issues of of infrastructure and capital, but it pushes on to unearth narratives of oppression and resistance. For instance, here I put up a slide about the Environmental Humanities Laboratories project, Toxic Bios, as one example of this kind of work. A participatory, and that's the Environmental Humanities Laboratory in Stockholm at the Royal Institute of Technology. A participatory project aimed at co-designing a grassroots plan to address climate change in New York is the Climate Action Lab at the City University of New York Graduate Center. This represents another approach in justice and solutions-oriented environmental humanities that doesn't depend on deus ex machina technical optimism. We hear the word emergency a lot these days, and for good reason. The prevailing logic is that we need quick answers. The social ecological crisis is indeed very serious and requires urgent answers. But before we launch headlong into the quest for solutions, we cannot abdicate our responsibility to scrutinize the very terms of the questions themselves. Wrong questions will never lead to the right solutions, no matter how quickly they stimulate a coordinated response. Ethical efforts to address social ecological crises require not only a deeper scientific or technical understanding of their causes, but also their frequently unjust effects on the most vulnerable. Thus, recognizing the entangled social and ecological aspects of current global crises reminds us pointedly that environmental problems are also social. This fundamental insight underscores the principal point that my co-authors and I, are arguing in this chapter and in this talk, namely that the environmental humanities are exceptionally well equipped to address the intersexual dimensions intersectional dimensions of these crises beyond calls for profit-generating techno-fixes and the reductive reification of the problems. As long as the world depends on profitable solutions to intractable problems, there will be unacceptable built-in risks that the profit motive will outweigh planetary needs in the fullest multi-species sense, which is no real solution at all. For these reasons, among others, my co-authors and I believe that the environmental humanities may be even more necessary now than ever before to challenge the profound crisis of collective imagination and will that have not yet produced actionable alternatives to present organization of social ecological relationships on Earth. And this is part of the value, frankly, of the environmental humanities to sustainability science as an international field, which is itself quite young and which is itself integrative of a number of different disciplines and especially natural sciences and technical disciplines, but until recently hasn't involved the humanities. The environmental humanities provide powerful thematic and methodological tools for investigating the causes of our social ecological crises. The rich debate on the Anthropocene, for example, on its nature and origins, proves this point explicitly. Many scholars in the field are not at all satisfied with the universalist implications of the age of humans narrative. Instead, their work focuses on inequalities deeply embedded in our social ecological crises. The idea of culpability of the human species as a monolithic actor in the Earth system is exposed as patently inaccurate and misleading, not least in its partial shifting of blame to those with the least influence over prevailing conditions, who are also among those suffering the most, and those typically in the global south and the so-called undeveloped part of the world, which is a concept which is itself fraught with all sorts of problems. This is they've historically contributed at least to the situation and to the present crisis. Now, Hannes Bergthaler et al. Proposed environmental justice as one of the possible cornerstones on which the environmental humanities could be built as an interdisciplinary project. And I'll quote their article from 2014. As a concept, environmental justice certainly identifies overlapping territory where social, cultural, and environmental challenges must be confronted all at once. Analysis of the unequal distribution of environmental burdens and privileges across more or less developed countries is not only the prerogative of social scientists, of sociologists, geographers, ecological economists, and political ecologists in general, but also of humanities scholars. And I would say a dozen years before Bergthaler et al. Were making these points were already being made forcefully by Joni Adamson, May Evans, and Rachel Stein, and their edited volume on the environmental justice reader, and by many of the authors that contributed to this volume. As early as 2005, Lawrence Buell underlined the relevance of the environmental justice movement for literary eco-criticism, as, in fact, Joni Adamson and Scott Slovic have reminded us in an article in 2009. This represented a shift from a conventional focus on nature writing by some of the major proponents and leading theorists of first-wave eco-criticism to a broader understanding of what environmental writings and eco-critical analyses could become. What the following years have revealed is that both primary texts and critical discourse addressing these works have become tools not only for fostering understanding and building awareness of environmental issues beyond national imaginaries, but also for dismantling powerful cultural tropes and narratives that have long upheld dominant paradigms. That is, for example, the setter colonialist, toxic masculinists, laissez-faire capitalists paradigms, among others, through which human communities and natural systems have long been exploited and abused. Something similar happened in the environmental history field when scholars started to evolve from the Eurocentric celebration of wilderness and the heroic history of its alleged protection to the mundane and brutal experiences of people living and working in contaminated environments. This narrative shift is significant as social variables such as race, gender, and class forcefully entered into the realm of what naively and reductively used to be called nature with a capital N, changing how scholars looked at the place of humans in nature with a lower case N, as well as how human groups act on, shape, and are infected, or rather are affected by environment. In contradistinction to nature with a big N, / nature with a small n, the concept of the environment expresses in a less historically loaded way the inextricability of human and natural systems, as these purportedly distinct dimensions continue to be called, I would have to point out, unapologetically in environmental sciences, in a usage that remains deeply influenced by Cartesian ontological dualism. I should point out here that this slide that I'm putting up here, this is not an implicit criticism or judgment of this volume. I put it up there only because it's a volume from this year, 2022, and human nature interactions in some fields in the natural sciences is still a very, very living concept, and it's one in which I think that in the environmental humanities inflected environmental studies has long been questioned. It's been getting questioned for 3 or 4 decades, if not more, the legitimacy of it. And this is one of these ways in which we have different competing environmental studies and sciences that need to be bridged. And this is what a lot of people are beginning to work on. And I think this is a major project within the environmental humanities. So, the environment as an alternative conception to nature, big N / nature, small n, represents an intractable conceptual and physical space that is always social ecological. An awakening to the limitations of nature as a concept, as classically understood and accepted through much of human history, has arguably been one of the forces animating the rise of modern environmental studies as distinct from environmental sciences, as a field influenced by the humanities, not least by the disciplines of philosophy, linguistics, cultural studies, and the history of science and ideas, but also, of course, many more. Environmental studies, quote, environmental studies is predicated on an operative conception of the environmental / the environment, necessarily distinct from unproblematized notions of the natural / nature that remain otherwise very much alive in the culture at large. And I didn't mean to quote that because it's kind of tacky. I'm actually quoting myself there, so I should have just taken the quotation marks away. I didn't notice that till I got to the end of the line. Sorry about that. Anyway, the environmental humanities spotlight on injustices has also mobilized a different set of questions and framed the issue of environmental justice in terms of narrative justice. The argument that subaltern communities have not only been harmed by the unequal distribution of environmental destruction and poisoning is central. Their stories of oppression and resistance have also been silenced and made invisible. My co-author, Marco Armiero, has written about the imposition of toxic narratives, that is, of the storytelling infrastructure, which hinders the possibility to even see the injustice, while blaming the affected communities for problems not caused by them, often blaming them because they are affected. That seems to be sometimes the logic of this. So in public discourses, it has often been said that the preservation of memory is indispensable in order to avoid the repetition of past and present mistakes. The environmental humanities can do much more than simply provide tools for archiving the memory of what has happened. Thinking of memory and environmental justice through an environmental humanities approach may also entail unpacking the plurality of memories experienced by different groups. And those multiple memories are always organized by power relations, which give different currencies to each of them. In this sense, the issue is not to preserve the memory, perhaps in some form of frozen mainstream musealization, but to explore and foster the plurality of memories and to investigate the suppression and repression of some of these memories through insurgent museology, among other methods, arts practices, to name just one. In the wake of Black Lives Matter, when racist and colonial textures of public memory have been unveiled and challenged so powerfully, the environmental humanities can contribute to that emancipatory project by exploring the toxic legacy embedded everywhere around us in monuments, toponymy, syllabi, cultural industry, and perhaps even the paintings that loom over us from the walls of our university libraries or higher administration offices. Similarly, human rights abuses in conjunction with environmental, economic, and public health crises often intersect in divergent, that is, separate and unequal forms of interaction that demographically disadvantaged groups and communities may experience in the cultural patchworks of civil society and the public sphere. In our early work on this concept of syndemic, Joni Adamson and I have addressed how the, and I quote, discriminatory practices that target minority communities for violent policing and polluting industries are, in many cases, effectively the same practices that are putting African, Latinx, and Indigenous Americans at heightened risk for COVID-19. We'll hear much more from Joni during the Food Futures Conference on this topic of syndemic, so I'm not going to say anything more about it right now, but I thought it was worth noting that this falls within this tradition. And one of the most sort of productive approaches happening within the environmental humanities. Rob Nixon has been one of the most vocal proponents of what we have called the political ecology of narratives and memories. His slow violence and the environmentalism of the poor has become a cornerstone. That volume has become a cornerstone in the making of a politically engaged in environmental humanities. Nixon analyzes a vast array of writer activists, often from the global south, uncovering their counter-hegemonic narratives of the slow violence enforced on them by global capitalism. However, for Nixon, those counter-hegemonic narratives are not only a denunciation of violence, they often offer imaginative visions of possible futures. Exploring narratives allows both of these objectives, and others as well, to be accomplished. The prefigurative, cautionary, and preparatory potentials of narratives, whether in the form of science fiction or as popular scientific illustrations of the effects of environmental change based on scientifically rigorous climate models, these provide good examples of cultural texts beyond more traditional literary works that the environmental humanities are particularly well positioned to explore. The Environmental Humanities Laboratory, to mention the center in Stockholm that my co-author Marco Armiero is the director of, is chosen as its slogan the phrase undisciplining humanities since 2011, when the first beginnings of the lab were forming there. Now, a slogan is neither a theoretical nor a methodological essay. It's primarily a declaration of principle, or to use the words of Thomas Pernecki, an act of declaration. And it states a refusal even before a proposal without offering arguments for either. Being undisciplined therefore implies the freedom to say no to conventional ways of organizing and legitimating knowledge production. The explicit function of academic disciplines is to organize knowledge, people, and the world. We should not confuse our organization of the world for purposes of intelligibility and dissemination of our ideas with the world itself. In other words, it's not only scientific knowledge that is ordered following the logic of disciplinary cataloging, but it's the very object of study that in turn is cataloged, classified, and above all separated from the rest of experienced reality. Being undisciplined, therefore, does not mean being unconventional or naive or lacking analytical, theoretical, or methodological rigor. Rather, it can mean being prepared to be epistemologically anarchical, if necessary, in a quest to free oneself while acknowledging the limitations of the disciplined knowledge in which we, as humanities scholars, or social science scholars, or artists, have long trained, very often in support of a status quo that has been at various turns colonialist, discriminatory, repressive, rapacious, in a word, unjust. Um, in this sense, being undisciplined is directly connected to feminist and decolonial calls to free our minds, to situate and decolonize ourselves in order to be accountable for our knowledge production practices and their applications in the wider world. This is not a statement against methods nor against disciplinary concentrations of knowledge as accessible, intelligible, or communicable through particular theoretical frameworks or discourses, as much as it is a way of mobilizing multidisciplinarity, of mobilizing transdisciplinarity, and recognizing that there are other legitimate ways of doing research that may not be long established, or rather that may not be long established through time-honored traditions of disciplined scientific logic. Um, Here, I was going to go a little into the eco-critical, or rather the material eco-critical part of this, but I noticed that this is taking longer for me to talk through than I had timed it when I read it without reading it aloud. So I'm unfortunately going to have to omit or lead the material eco-critical part of this paper, which has really strong arguments that I really would urge people to read. If you get a chance, read. I'll share the title of this chapter that will be appearing in a much fuller form later this year. But I'm unfortunately going to have to go over that now and sort of end up with a very quick discussion, concluding discussion of integrated environmental humanities, which is where, in fact, here's the chapter I mentioned. So this will come out later this year, and anyone who's interested can read the full version of this that doesn't have to jump over certain parts. I think that rather, I'm going to depart a little bit from my text and just sum this up by going quickly through the slides and ad-libbing a little bit more because I'm concerned about finishing up in the next couple of minutes if possible. So I think what I'd like to point out is that there were efforts that were underway beginning in around 2015 when the COP27 took place, or rather COP21 took place, and when the Paris Agreement was formulated. At the same time that that was going on, the Sustainable Development Goals, also in the fall of 2015, were formulated. And a number of efforts were undertaken at UNESCO and with other agencies and other UN agencies as well as non-UN entities to begin taking a look at the field of sustainability science, which had effectively been around for about 15 years as an integrated field, very strongly based in the natural sciences and to a certain degree the social sciences, but not often inclusive of all of the qualitative social sciences, let's say. A project was started with funding from the government of Japan that was a UNESCO project to look at the field of sustainability science and make a series of recommendations about how that field could grow and develop and be more effective in service of the international community trying to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. And there was a 3 or 4 workshop project called Broadening the Application of the Sustainability Science Approach that released after 2 years a set of guidelines that had been worked out over 4 international workshops. I think one of the most important parts of that process was in these guidelines acknowledging the absolute necessity that the environmental humanities and that the humanities beyond the environmental humanities, other humanistic subjects and disciplines, as well as qualitative social sciences, as well as, to a certain degree, the arts, but also as well as non-academic knowledge communities, needed to be integrated into sustainability science and into the science policy interface in authentic ways, not in instrumentalist ways, not in simply a translational role to translate the findings of science done by natural scientists, but actually to be part of the co-design, co-production of knowledge. And this resulted in a process to establish a new sustainability science coalition, which is called Bridges, which is since launched. And part of the explicit logic of Bridges, which is now made up of something like 40 plus organizations and institutions from around the world, is to actually have humanities-centered sustainability science, as oxymoronic as that might sound. It's deliberately framed that way because in order to make the most of this decade of action to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, to achieve the 2030 agenda, and deliver the goals and objectives that have been sought for between this decade and through 2050, it's broadly acknowledged that there are knowledge communities that have been outside the periphery of mainstream sustainability science, whose knowledge is too vital, too important to be leaving out, and there have to be ways found to integrate these communities more effectively and to bridge different scientific domains, all in service of the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. So this is something that's going on right now. There's a large international effort with many different partners. Certainly UNESCO is one of them, but the International Council for Philosophy and Human Sciences, or CIPSH, that's another one. The Club of Rome is another one. The International Science Council, the World Academy of Arts and Sciences, among many other broad, large international organizations, as well as local and regional organizations, including indigenous communities, including other communities and foundations and NGOs that have more of a local setting in a particular regional area. These are working together now to try to find ways of realizing in practice the bridging across different sectors and different disciplines, and bringing and eliciting the knowledge that can come from the humanities that has so far not played a very meaningful role in the science policy interface and in the field of sustainability science. And that's where we are right now. This is the challenge of building new communities of purpose, which is a concept that has been enshrined in the principles of this new global coalition for humanities-led and humanities-engaged sustainability science. And I'd be happy to answer a couple of questions about that after this talk. I'm out of time now. I've gone a few minutes over. Sorry about that. But I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. So that's what I have for you today. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Hartman, for this very succinct presentation of environmental humanities as an interdisciplinary or post-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, but it's a pluralistic enterprise and endeavor, and definitely not a simple task. So the floor is open. We have 10 minutes. So please raise your hand and then go ahead, turn on your mic so that we can enter this conversation with Professor Hartman. There you go. Yes, yes. This is, yeah, please go ahead. This is Professor, is that Professor? Is that David? Oh. Okay.
Excuse me, is it my turn or?
Yes, yes, please,
All right.
please.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm Maury. I'm a PhD student in
Oh,
anthropology
Maury.
at
Okay.
the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I especially like your talk because I have a degree in environmental humanities, and I also work closely with scientists in sustainability science. And in my observation, I can tell you that okay, uh, environmental science, climate science, and geoscientists, they really want to know what kind of impact that climate change will bring to our society or to our cultural heritage. I think there would be a very good opportunity, to develop more connection with scientists. I know that Future Earth and Bellman Foam, they're putting a lot of effort on bridging the gap between science and humanity. And maybe we should take this opportunity to have more conversation with them. That's just my observation and suggestion. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Maury. Okay.
Uh, should I
Okay,
answer?
Johnny. Well, why don't we just collect a few comments
Okay,
so that you
sure.
can respond only one because we are running out of time. So we have Professor Johnny Adamson, right? Okay.
Stephen, thank you so much for your talk. That was a really wonderful overview, and thanks for going deep into the field genealogy. That was very instructive. I was wondering if you could talk more about the role of humanities for the environment in the formation of bridges.
Yeah, Humanities for the Environment was one of. Should I take this now or should I wait?
Yes, please, please,
Sorry.
please. Yes.
Yeah, Humanities for the Environment was one of the three founding major partners of the Global Coalition for. So the three founding partner organizations were UNESCO and for the International Council for Philosophy and Human Sciences and Humanities for the Environment. And they led and co-led this 2-year process to vision what the coalition's principles would be, what its action plan would be, what its goals would be, both for creating stronger collaborations cross sectors and between humanities, social sciences, arts, and the natural sciences and non-academic knowledge communities. This was all part of this 2-year process of 4 international workshops, and Humanities for the Environment was right at the center of it, I would say. And of course, Humanities for the Environment is having a really important role in the anchoring of the global the Bridges Coalition through ASU Global Future Laboratory and its sponsorship of the flagship hub of the Bridges Coalition together, I know, with other local partners such as Humanities Lab that Sally is also involved in at ASU, but also the University of Pretoria is also sponsoring a hub of bridges, and so Humanities for the Environment continues to be very, very prominent as institutionally and organizationally as at the center of the entire Bridges Coalition movement. I can't hear you, Shinya. I think maybe you're saying something, but your mute
Oh, okay. Professor Sally Kish will be the next, please. Professor Kish.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen, for that great review and overview. I was particularly struck by your observation, which we've all been saying, but sometimes forget about the difference between the disciplinary divisions and the world we actually live in. And that it's such a mistake to think the world conforms to the system that we have proposed. And it's based on that I'm sort of following up on Maury's question, which is, how can we create this dialogue more deliberately, more visibly, more publicly? We know that scientists are wanting the information and the analyses and critiques that environmental humanities provide because they're stymied, that their scientific solutions are not being adopted. But we have many structural issues, which I've actually written about it, between the sciences and humanities. But is there a way, and maybe is Bridges a mechanism for creating a more public engagement and dialogue among these disciplines interested in sustainability?
I'd like to take this opportunity to answer that question and Maury's question at the same time, because I think the answer to that is yes. And I think that that's beginning to happen already. It had already begun to happen before this process was concluded. That was an outcome of this earlier project focused on the guidelines for sustainability science and rethinking what sustainability science should and could look like and how it could function, and envisioning a role, but not yet fully worked out for integrating the humanities and qualitative social sciences. But already as part of that role, Future Earth was one of the partners involved in the entire process of forming Bridges as well. It wasn't one of the founding partners, but it and the International Science Council were both heavily involved in the entire process as well. And the logic there was that these are both heavily natural sciences and sort of like technical sciences based organizations that largely have their constituency is largely based in natural sciences and technical sciences. And they realized the need to begin collaborating with humanists and qualitative social sciences. And therefore, from the beginning, they were part of that. Now, what's beginning to happen now is Bridges, for instance, together with Future Earth is slated to do a side event at this year's COP27 in Egypt. And Bridges, together with Future Earth, is launching, was invited by Future Earth to launch a Bridges/Future Earth forum, online forums, it's a webinar series that's part of the Pathways to Sustainability series that Future Earth already runs, but they want to make ever so many iterations in this series of events a team up between Bridges and Future Earth. And that's exactly what Bridges was created to do. It was both created to build capacity in the humanities and to talk about how we could do that, how that could be operationalized, but also to do a lot of advocacy work, reaching across to other well-established organizations and institutions in the sustainability science domain internationally, and begin to find ways to work together and collaborate together.
Well, thank you. Do we have any more questions? Feedback? We are a little bit running out of time. This is 1 minute past 11 o'clock. Unless you have any, we do have one more hand here, right? Let me see. Who is that? Okay. I have to figure out.
It says
Yeah.
Penny.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Penny Jiang. Okay. Would you like to turn on your screen?
Yes, hello everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm a student from Taiwan University and my name is Penny. First of all, I want to thank you, Professor Hartman, for your insightful speech. And I personally believe that building up an intimate connection with the land is very crucial for cultivating environmental sustainability. And speaking of this, I would like to share how the indigenous people from Taiwan bring one another together through the revitalization of agricultural practices. Currently, there are 16 official indigenous groups in Taiwan, which accounts for less than 3% of Taiwan's total population. Although my mother is Han-Chinese, my father is from a Lu Kai tribe called Darmak, and it is only less than 10 minutes away from where I live now. I joined the local youth group about 4 years ago, and the young people from the community are responsible for the preparation of the tribal activities. The rituals from Darmak tribe reflects the different stages of millet, from sowing to harvest. Our major festivals include Weeding Festival and Harvest Festival. And in addition, The division of labor between men and women is very strict, and it's usually the female elders who teach the young women knowledge of growing millet. And before the harvest festival, the female elders usually lead the young women actually go to the mountain or fields to collect vines. And the men are usually responsible for the training of the young men in the tribal assembly institutes. And during the preparation of the festival, there is a close collaboration between elderly and the younger people. And we also raise our awareness about like building up the intimate relationship with the lands that our ancestors lived for hundreds of years until our generation. And furthermore, my grandparents grew millets by themselves. So I'm pretty used to millets being part of my daily life. We use millets for various purposes, such as for rituals, decorations, or cuisines like millets wine, millets porridge, and a kind of indigenous food called abai. And it's kind of like the indigenous version of rice dumpling. And through this conference, I got an opportunity to reflect on the crucial role of millets. Due to the annual preparation for the harvest festival, the younger people finally come back to the tribe and strive to learn the wisdom from our ancestors as well as those agricultural knowledge. And as Professor Ling said in his talk yesterday, food not only brings the tribal people together, but also reveals the political and the social issues we are facing nowadays, such as labor shortage due to modernization, cultural loss under colonization, and land justice issues, just to name a few. And lastly, I will just put the keywords and the links in the comment section for your reference. To clarify, it's just my personal experience and observations from the Darumak tribe. And I'm really glad to be able to make a little contribution for this community. So that's all of my sharing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really great to learn of this. And I was fascinated by the lecture yesterday that Professor Yirandin gave on this work that's going on and this restoration that's happening and the intergenerational and ecological food waste connections and community engagement that's happening from within the community. It's just really fascinating. And so now that I've learned about this, I can't wait to read up more on what's going on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your comment.
Well, thank you, Penny. A very young, talented student from Taidong University, which is on the other side of the island on the east coast. So thank you, Penny. If you can, come and join us in Taipei or over the weekend. Otherwise, everything will be live streamed. So feel free to pop in with your more comments, based on your community experience. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much.
Sort of your experience sort of tied up two seminars, one from yesterday, the other given today by Professor Hartman. So thank you. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So I think that's about what we can do within this very limited time. But thank you so much, everybody, for your participation, and particularly our gratitude to Professor Hartman for giving us such a very important, knowledge about environmental humanities and how we can engage ourselves in the common endeavor action, to have an influence in environmental humanities, sustainability, science. Okay, so shall we say goodbye? And I will see you this afternoon, 1 o'clock again, for a book talk in honor of Professor Deborah Rose, and that's a very important talk. So come back and join us after lunch. And at the same time, I would like to let you know that you have to go to our conference official site for the program. Professor Hartman is going to give a plenary speech on community of purpose, right? And Professor Johnny Adamson is going to give a keynote on syndemic. So how we are going to put all this concept together and integrated the knowledge, and at the same time, we have engagement action, as Professor Cage just pointed out. So thank you very much, and see you in a while.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.